When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject, Hicks. User, BullS11. Posted, September 1st, 1996.
Even before I considered the possibility that hell was real, I knew I was going there. When you kill 21 people, there's a price to pay, and my bill has come due. It began this morning with a phone call. I was still sleeping off yesterday's bender, my head throbbing like an infected wound. I ignored it. It rang for 30 minutes, 20 of that under a pillow I used to muffle the sound. The thought that it might be work was the only thing keeping me from yanking the cord out of the wall and sinking back into sleep. Bleary-eyed, I picked up the receiver. What? Is that any kind of way to talk to an old friend? Recognition cut through the fog of my hangover in an instant. It was a teenager's voice. Not just any teenager, though. It was Hicks, even though that wasn't possible. Who is this? I tried to keep the waver out of my voice. It's not the Pope, Mikey boy. Come on, you know exactly who this is. Happy anniversary, buddy. How's life been? Real shitty? That's okay, big guy. You don't have to worry about that anymore. His voice took on a sing-songy cadence as he mimicked the theme song to Cheers. A lot of people are waiting for you down here, Mikey boy, and every single one of them knows your name. They know what you did too, did you? I slammed the receiver down, ending the call. Chris Hicks had been an asshole and a bully. The whole time I was in school, he made it his personal mission to bust my balls. He'd beat me up, steal my books, sometimes both. One of his favorite things to do was humiliate me, especially in front of the senior girls. The faculty at our school didn't give a shit, so the fact he finally escalated things to the point they suspended him really says a lot about his willingness to go above and beyond. I looked at the calendar hanging above the phone, December 2nd. It couldn't have been Hicks on the phone, I thought, but he had been right about it being the anniversary. It was 20 years to the day that he'd caught up to me in Piedmont Park on my way home from school. I don't know if he'd been eating his Wheaties or what, but the beating he gave me that day was enough to keep me home until the new year, and it didn't end there. Once the beating was done, long after I was unable to do anything but moan weakly on the snowy path and try to cover my head, I heard what sounded like a zipper. Sure enough, a second later, a warm, acrid-smelling stream lanced over me, soaking my jacket. The motherfucker was pissing on me. If I had to guess, it was that, his coup de grace that finally tipped the school over into action. They were fine with violence, but peace stuff seemed vaguely sexual to them, and in Indiana, the only thing they hate more than people who don't look like them is sex of any kind. I'd like to say my parents supported me through that whole situation, but it'd be a lie. Even if they'd never admit it, I think both of them were ashamed of me for allowing it to happen. The fact he was 4 years older and nearly a foot taller than me apparently didn't seem to factor into their calculus. The experience changed me. I don't know how it couldn't. I got angry deep down, the sort of white-hot rage that turns into cancer halfway through your life if you don't do something about it. Well, I couldn't say exactly when. A moment came during the month I spent healing where I decided I wasn't going to live with this rage. Oh no, I was going to do something about it. I was going to kill Chris Hicks. The how of it took longer to make itself obvious until I was back at school with him. After his suspension, Hicks kept his distance and I only saw him a handful of times, usually smoking at the quad or ripping out of the parking lot in his truck. It's hard to say whether he was bored of fucking with me or just afraid of the consequences if he did. There was also a third possibility, which is where I often landed. Deep down, Chris knew he couldn't go back to penny ante shit like smashing my glasses. No way. He could only go further, except his Christmas present to me had been to take us both to the furthest edge of bullying. To go any further past that would mean doing something serious, something final. I wonder, was he as ready as I was to go over that cliff? He never got the chance. Our neighbor Joe was a county pest control guy who liked to drink. It wasn't an all-the-time thing. He'd stay on the wagon for a while, then fall off into a 2 or 3 day long bender. Rinse, repeat. Sober Joe was a fastidious employee who cared deeply about the stewardship of the work equipment he kept in the shed on his property. Drunk Joe wasn't as conscientious, coming home from a busy day of rat poisoning already half in the bag and leaving that very same shed wide open. I bided my time, waiting for him to fall off the wagon. Less than a month had gone by before I got my chance to slip into the shed. As I'd hoped, it was chock full of what I needed, specifically compound 1080, sodium fluoroacetate. 1080 is one of the most potent commercial poisons in the world. It's illegal now and was, in fact, illegal then too. Banned after it had been used to thin out the country's coyote population. Joe had hated using it. The dogs convulsed grotesquely before they died, he said. He felt nothing deserved to go out that way. I felt differently and took the heavy plastic tub when I left, locking the shed door behind me. All I knew about Compound 1080 was what Joe had told me, namely that it was water-soluble and so toxic that if you weren't careful about where you dumped it, you could poison the water table. Looking back, it's kind of a miracle I didn't end up accidentally killing myself mixing it that day at the quarry. The white salts dissolved easily into the bucket of water, helped along by some gentle stirring. I didn't know how much to use, so I kept going until all but a few handfuls of the compound was left. Then I unwrapped the pack of smokes I'd bought on the way out and carefully dipped each of them one at a time in the solution. They were Chris's brand and dried a shade darker than they were at the beginning, but I didn't think it was enough he'd notice. Getting the poisoned cigarettes to him was the easiest part. The cocky bastard never locked his truck, so all I had to do was wait until he'd gone into class and leave the pack on his console. Why would he think anything other than he'd just forgotten buying it? The tricky part, I figured, would be getting the rest of the cigarettes back after he was dead. The last thing I wanted was anyone else getting hurt. I suppose that was naive. Instead, what happened was the convulsion hit Hicks while he was driving, speeding in a residential zone, no less. His truck plowed into the 10-penny cafe and in the process ruptured a gas line, killing everyone inside. 20 people died alongside Hicks that day, one for each of the cigarettes that burned up alongside them. Given the person he was, everyone in town just assumed he'd lost control of the wheel. In a case like that, no one was going to bother ordering an autopsy, meaning I got away with murder. Murders. In a legal sense, at least. Morally, spiritually, they've hung around my neck like an albatross for almost 2 decades. I always wondered how the universe would balance the scales, whether I'd get that horrible cancer I'd been trying to forestall when this whole thing began. Hicks's voice on the phone had been my answer. It seemed fitting that he'd call this our anniversary and not the day he died. December 2nd was the day our destinies were bound up together forever. He spent the 20 years since then in hell. Now, it's my turn.
Subject: Kingfisher. User: Art and Honor. Posted April 9th, 1997.
There are people out there who have a problem with the woods, but I'm not one of them. My childhood was spent on a homestead out in the Payette National Forest where my brother Bradley and I would spend hours playing hide and seek among stands of ponderosa pine. It instilled in both of us a healthy respect for nature. Consequently, even though I've been living in the city for 25 years, I still look forward to the times I can make the drive back to see Mom, who still lives in the house where we grew up. Mom's been on her own since '91, when Dad insisted on reshingling the roof himself and fell off, landing straight on his head. It was a stupid, pointless way to die, and because she'd been the one to encourage him to do the work himself, rather than dealing with the hassle of hiring roofers, she took it even harder. Bradley and I suggested she consider selling and moving somewhere she wouldn't be alone so much. First after the funeral, then repeatedly in the years since. For all the good it did, we may as well have been speaking Martian. For the first 4 years after Dad's passing, it did seem like Mom was adapting well. She started going into town more, joined a book club at the library, even got back into sketching, something she hadn't done since we were little. Bradley lives in New York, so he gets most of his mom news from me, and I remember telling him I wouldn't be surprised if she eventually found herself a gentleman friend before too long. He thought that was gross, of course. I wouldn't have minded, though. Dad wasn't coming back, and no one should be alone unless it's by choice. Something has shifted over the last couple years, though, and not in a good way. On my most recent visit, I asked why she hadn't mentioned book club in a while, and she just waved her hand dismissively. On the subject of her last visit to town, her expression clouded for a moment until she randomly spat out a day. It was a lie, and not a very good one. It was a day I'd been there with her. Pointing it out got me another one of those nasty little waves. If I hadn't found her stash of sketch pads stuffed away in the back of the heavy dining room credenza while looking for some of Dad's old photo negatives, I might have suggested to Mom she needed to be tested for dementia. Now, I'm worried it's something much worse. Before I go further, you should understand something about our family's property. Owning land in national forests and parks isn't common, but it happens. Usually it's because the land is privately owned when the surrounding areas are consolidated in the park and the owner declines to sell. That's the case for us, as Generations of Lancasters have been born and raised in that section of woods since before Idaho joined the Union. And I know what you're thinking, that if you go back far enough, all settled land was bought by blood, and 99% of the time you'd be right. Our land, though, before we settled there, no one wanted it at all. The Nez Perce, Northern Shoshone, and Northern Paiute were all threaded through what would become the Payette National Forest, and every one of them avoided the area entirely. According to the family Bible, their name for it was the Folding Land. No further explanation is given. As I said before, I've never had a problem with our woods. That's not true for other members of our family. The same family Bible lists not a handful of sudden deaths having taken place there, including Dad's, alongside an even half-dozen family members who just never came home. We're not a superstitious bunch, and so didn't consider these events anything more than the result of bad luck or animal attacks, both real dangers when you live on your own in the sticks. My dreams, though, those were strange. Every few weeks up until the age of 16, I would have long, vivid dreams where I was walking through the forest. Sometimes I'd be seeing it in the daytime, sometimes at night. Sometimes the land would look as it does in the real world, and sometimes it would be completely different. Once, I remember cautiously walking past the glow of campfires around which hunched frog-like creatures the size of linebackers. They had set up tents using thick wooden poles and a kind of rubbery sheet that looked like stretched mucus. Inside were other creatures like the ones I'd seen outside, except these were wounded, missing legs, arms, deep furrows gouged into their fleshy green faces. Many times I found myself wandering through a nameless city, its steel and glass towers stretching far into the distance. People wandered its streets, tall, beautiful, elegantly dressed people whose faces lacked the pinched look of stress I'd come to recognize during my visits to Bradley in New York. The greenery might have had something to do with that. Moss wound its way along the exteriors of the buildings, giving them an appearance of total harmony with their environment. On only a handful of occasions did I have nightmares about the forest. I was always alone in a sea of darkness, trying to avoid the cold, wet caresses of things I couldn't see. Only once did I see anything during those dreams, a brief glimpse on the horizon when the clouds above parted just enough for the moon to peek through. The closest I can come to describing it is as a perversion of the bird we call Kingfisher, a drooping black thing bigger than any of the buildings I'd seen on other nights. Its beak was raised to the sky as it let loose a cry so powerful it shook the black seas that separated us. I woke up in a cold sweat. I never again dreamed of our land or that awful thing, really because I'd never thought of it as more than a particularly messed up expression of something going on in my teenage mind. I sort of just forgot about it. Until I opened the first of Mom's hidden sketchbooks and saw it there, scrawled in charcoal across every page.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.